Chapter 1. Cold Snap. They say the universe doesn't make mistakes. They say that when the fate string snaps taut between two souls, it carries the warmth of a rising sun, a sudden, violent homecoming that makes the brutal reality of a shifter's life finally make sense. They lied. The frost had arrived 3 weeks before the winter solstice, dropping over the whispering crags like a heavy, suffocating shroud. As a tracker for the Silverwood pack, my skin was accustomed to the bite of the northern wind, but tonight, the cold felt different. It didn't just nip at my cheeks, it felt intentional. It crept along the forest floor, silencing the insects, freezing the pine needles into fragile glass shards that shattered beneath my boots. I pulled the fur collar of my coat tighter around my throat, my eyes scanning the dense line of ancient pines. Something was bleeding into our territory. Not a physical beast, not yet, but an energy so heavy it made the air taste like iron. "Elena, talk to me," a voice crackled through the earpiece nestled in my hair. It was Jace, my beater, his tone laced with the quiet anxiety that had gripped our entire pack since the announcement of the summit. "Do you see anything on the northern perimeter?" "Nothing visible," I whispered back, my breath pluming into white clouds that hung suspended in the stagnant air. "But the woods are dead silent, Jace. The deer have fled south. Even the crows aren't moving. It's like the forest is holding its breath." "The obsidian pack has just crossed the valley floor," Jace warned, his voice dropping an octave. "Alpha Malachi's convoy is arriving at the Longhouse now. Your father wants you back inside, Elena. Now. We don't need the dark wolves catching our best tracker prowling the borders like an enemy." "I'm on my way," I murmured, though my eyes remained glued to the tree line. For months, rumors of Alpha Malachi had drifted through the territories like wildfire. They called him the Black Monarch. He wasn't just an alpha. He was a conqueror who had swallowed 3 neighboring packs in less than 2 winters, absorbing their lands and silencing their leadership. Our small, peaceful territory was the final buffer between his empire and the sea. This summit wasn't a peaceful diplomatic meeting, it was an execution disguised as an alliance. And we all knew it. Shaking off the unnatural chill, I turned and sprinted back toward the ancestral longhouse. My wolf stirred beneath my skin, restless and pacing, her golden eyes flashing behind my own as I bounded over frozen logs and slick rock faces. But it wasn't the fear of a fight that made my heart hammer against my ribs. It was an overwhelming instinctual urge to run in the opposite direction, away from the longhouse, away from the lights. When I slipped through the heavy oak side doors of the grand hall, the sudden wall of heat and sound hit me like a physical blow. Roasted meats, heavy pine resins, and the thick, suffocating scent of hundreds of wolves packed into a single space. My father, the aging alpha of the Silverwood pack, stood at the head of the long table, his shoulders squared but his posture rigid, with an exhaustion he couldn't entirely hide. Jace stepped up beside me, handing me a glass of spiced cider to warm my freezing hands. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jace murmured, glancing at my pale face. "Just the winter," I lied, gripping the warm glass. Suddenly, the roaring chatter in the hall died. The silence didn't fall gradually. It dropped, like an axe. The heavy front doors of the longhouse swung open, letting in a blast of sub-zero wind that flickered the thousands of candles lining the stone walls. And then, they entered. The obsidian pack didn't march, they moved like a shadow flowing across the floor. They were flanked by enormous scarred enforcers dressed in dark leather and heavy furs, their eyes predatory and fixed on our people with blatant disdain. But it was the man at the center who drew the air from the room, Alpha Malachi. He was younger than the legend suggested, tall and violently elegant, with sharp, aristocratic features and hair as black as a raven's wing. A heavy, dark fur coat draped over his broad shoulders, but beneath it, his posture was entirely relaxed, the absolute, terrifying confidence of a predator who knew he was at the very top of the food chain. His scent preceded him, a heavy, suffocating wave of crushed wintermint, ozone and old blood. My father stepped forward, his voice steady but strained. "Alpha Malachi, Silverwood welcomes you." Malachi didn't answer immediately. He stopped in the center of the hall, his dark eyes slowly scanning the room, dismissing our warriors, our elders, and our history with a single sweeping glance. And then, his gaze stopped. On me. The moment our eyes locked, the world shattered. I expected the warmth. I expected the golden thread, the legendary spark of recognition that every shifter prayed for from the moment they reached adulthood. I expected my wolf to howl in joy. Instead, a violent, Agonizing jolt shot through my spine. It felt as if a hand made of solid ice had reached inside my chest and wrapped around my beating heart, squeezing until the blood stopped flowing. The room tilted. The sound of the crackling hearth fire vanished, replaced by a high-pitched, deafening roar in my ears. My wolf didn't howl in joy. She shrieked in absolute terror, thrashing against the cage of my ribs, trying to claw her way out, trying to escape the invisible tether that had just violently slammed into our souls. No, my mind screamed into the void. No, no, no. Every instinct I possessed, every piece of ancestral knowledge buried in my DNA, was screaming a single, terrifying truth. This is wrong. This is a trap. The mate bond was supposed to be a sanctuary. This felt like a executioner's noose tightening around my throat. Across the room, Malachi didn't look shocked. He didn't stumble. A slow, terrifyingly satisfied smile curled the corners of his cruel mouth. His dark eyes flared with a strange, unnatural violet light that vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the cold triumph of a man who had just claimed exactly what he came for. He took a step toward me, his heavy boots echoing like a death knell against the stone floor. "Well, Alpha," Malachi's voice resonated through the silent hall, smooth as velvet and sharp as a razor, his eyes never leaving my frozen face. "It seems this summit is over before it even began. The universe has spoken. Your daughter belongs to the Obsidian Pack." I tried to breathe, but my lungs were filled with ice. I looked into the eyes of my fated mate, and for the first time in my life I knew what it felt like to look directly at the monster that was going to destroy me. Chapter 2. The Gilded Cage. The transition from the wild freedom of the Silverwood forests to the Obsidian Pack's ancestral estate didn't feel like a journey, it felt like a descent. For 3 days, the black armored convoy moved in absolute silence through jagged mountain passes where the rocks rose like broken teeth against a gray, bleeding sky. I sat in the leather-bound back seat of Malachi's private transport, the heavy glass windows sealing out the world. Beside me, Malachi never tried to touch me. He didn't offer comforting words, nor did he look at me with the fierce melting heat of a newly awakened mate. Instead he watched me. His dark eyes were fixed on the side of my face, tracking the rapid pulse in my throat, measuring the shallow depth of my breath, and all the while, that phantom noose around my soul remained taut. It didn't warm up. It didn't soften. It remained a frozen wire, humming with a low, agonizing vibration that kept my wolf paralyzed in the darkest corner of my mind. "You haven't touched your tea, Eleanor," Malachi's voice broke the silence, smooth and deceptively gentle, like velvet over a blade. "I'm not hungry," I said, keeping my gaze locked on the passing blurred pines outside. My voice sounded hollow, stripped of the vibrant energy I usually carried. "You will need your strength," he murmured, his fingers idly tapping against the silver head of his cane. "The Obsidian territory requires resilience. We do not tolerate weakness here. But then, that is why you are here, isn't it? Because your bloodline is anything but weak." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind sliced through me. My bloodline. Not my spirit. Not my heart. When the convoy finally cleared the tree line, the Obsidian stronghold loomed over the valley like a monolith of dark stone and iron. It wasn't a traditional pack manor. It was a sprawling Gothic fortress built into the face of a sheer cliff. Black ivy clung to the stone walls like veins, and narrow, arched windows stared out over the misty valleys below like hollow eyes. As the heavy iron gates groaned open, hundreds of wolves lined the cobblestone courtyard. They were silent, their heads bowed, but their scents bled into the freezing air. Fear, submission, and a sharp, bitter curiosity. Malachi stepped out first, extending a gloved hand to me. The moment my bare palm brushed his glove, the artificial bond flared, a shocking wave of freezing adrenaline spiking through my system. I swallowed a gasp, forcing my legs to move, stepping down into the wolf den of the conqueror. "Welcome to your new home, Luna," an elder wolf whispered as we passed, but the title tasted like ash in my mouth. Malachi didn't lead me to the grand hall, where a celebration feast was supposedly being prepared for the pack. Instead, he guided me up a winding, spiral staircase of cold black marble, deep into the residential spire of the fortress. The air up here smelled of dust, dried lavender, and something old and metallic. He stopped before a pair of towering mahogany doors, carved with intricate, twisting wolves, that looked more like they were devouring one another than running together. "Your quarters," Malachi said, pushing the doors open. The room was undeniably beautiful, but it was a mausoleum. A massive four-poster bed, draped in heavy charcoal velvet, sat beneath the vaulted ceiling. A roaring fire burned in a hearth made of black volcanic rock, but the heat failed to touch the deep, systemic chill in my bones. Large windows looked out over the sheer drop of the cliffside, offering a view of nothing but jagged rocks and swirling fog hundreds of feet below. "I will leave you to settle in," Malachi said, stepping back into the corridor. His gaze lingered on me, cold and analytical. "A feast will be brought to you. Rest, Elena. Tomorrow, the preparation for our formal binding begins." "Malachi," I called out, my voice trembling slightly as I turned to face him. "Why does it feel like this? The bond. Why does it hurt?" For a fraction of a second, his aristocratic facade cracked. A look of pure, clinical amusement danced in his dark eyes, a terrifying glimpse of the monster behind the kingly mask. "Fate is a heavy burden, my love," he whispered softly. "Sometimes it takes time for the flesh to accept what the stars have decreed." He pulled the heavy mahogany doors shut, the thud echoing like a gavel through the silent room. I stood frozen in the center of the lavish space, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silence of the room was heavy, suffocating. I forced myself to walk toward the large windows, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, looking down at the deadly drop below. Escape from this side was impossible. Turning back to the room, I began to pace, my tracker instincts taking over. I examined the stone joints, the heavy furniture, searching for any flaw, any vulnerability in my new cage. That was when I heard it. A sharp, metallic click from the corridor outside. It was a distinct, heavy sound, the slide of a massive iron deadbolt grinding into place, followed by the turning of a heavy, ancient key. My breath caught in my throat. I lunged across the room, grabbing the heavy brass handles of the mahogany doors, and pulled. The doors didn't budge. They were solid, unyielding. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining my enhanced hearing. Outside, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of two enforcers took up positions on either side of the entrance. They hadn't brought me here to be their new Luna. They hadn't brought me here to share a throne. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stripping the last remnants of warmth from my chest. I wasn't a bride-to-be. I wasn't a fated mate. I was a prisoner in a gilded cage, and the man who held the key was going to bleed me dry. Chapter 3. THE. Shadow on the Border. A locked door is an insult to a tracker. In the Silverwood Pack, my father had trained me to read the world through its fractures, the split in a broken twig, the subtle give of an unstable rock face, the hidden vulnerabilities of any perimeter. Malachi's fortress was a masterpiece of Gothic engineering, but it was still made by hands, and anything made by hands has a flaw. I waited until the deepest part of the night, when the ambient sounds of the fortress settled into a low, rhythmic hum. The heavy feast below had finally ended, leaving the distant corridors smelling of stale wine and burnt fat. Outside my door, the two enforcers shifted their weight, their breathing heavy and slow with the exhaustion of a long watch. I didn't use the door. Instead, I turned to the massive stone hearth. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing crimson embers, painting the charcoal velvet of the room in bloody shadows. Peering up into the wide, soot-stained chimney, I saw what I was looking for. Structural iron tethers, built into the stone to reinforce the cliffside masonry. Stripping off my heavy fur coat to move lighter, my wolf lent me her coiled, desperate strength. I leaped, gripping the first iron bar. The stone was tight, scraping my palms, but I climbed with a silent, feral intensity, bypassing the guards entirely. 3 stories up, the flue connected to an external ventilation grate overlooking the eastern terrace. With a hard, synchronized push from my heels, the rusted grate gave way. I tumbled out onto the narrow stone ledge, the sub-zero mountain air hitting my bare skin like a whip. Below me was a 300-foot drop into a sea of churning, violent white fog. Above me, the shattered moon bled pale light through the mist. I didn't look down. Balancing on instincts alone, I scaled the rough volcanic stone of the outer wall, dropping into the shadows of the lower courtyard, and slipped through the perimeter spikes where the black ivy grew thickest. Within minutes I was swallowed by the obsidian border woods. The forest here was different from the silverwood pines. The trees were ancient, twisted, their bark dark as charcoal, and their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The silence was absolute. The artificial bond in my chest pulsed with a steady, sickening rhythm, a psychic compass constantly trying to drag my mind back toward the fortress, back toward Malachi. Every step away from him felt like pulling a hook deeper into my flesh. I ran until my lungs burned, until the frost coated my eyelashes and my breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. I needed to map this territory. I needed a way out. Suddenly, the wind shifted. The scent hit me first. It wasn't the suffocating, engineered mint and ozone of Malachi. This was raw, wild and heavy. Crushed pine needles, damp earth, smoke, and the sharp, dangerous tang of an unaligned alpha wolf. My tracker instinct screamed at me to drop. I lunged into the hollow of a massive, decaying oak tree, pressing my back against the damp wood, holding my breath. The crunch of a boot on frozen snow echoed through the fog, slow, deliberate, the sound of someone who wasn't tracking, but someone who owned the shadows themselves. "You're a long way from the gilded cage, little bird," a voice rasped. It was low, rough as gravel, and completely devoid of the smooth, aristocratic polish that filled Malachi's halls. I froze, my hands sliding down to the silver-tipped hunting dagger strapped to my thigh. I stepped out from the hollow oak, my eyes adjusting to the shifting mist. A man stood in the clearing. He was massive, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow in the moonlight. He wore tattered, rugged furs over dark, battle-worn leathers, but it was his face that held me captive. He was devastatingly handsome, with a sharp, rugged jawline covered in dark stubble, but a jagged, pale scar cut down from his left temple, splitting his cheek, a brutal mark of survival. His eyes weren't dark like Malachi's. They were a piercing, luminescent silver that seemed to cut right through the fog. He looked at me, his gaze dropping to the luxurious silk tunic I still wore from the estate. A cynical, bitter smile touched his lips. "Malachi's new prize," he muttered, taking a slow step forward. I smelled the black monarch's stench on the wind from miles away. "Did you get lost on your way to his bed, Luna? I am no one's prize," I snapped, my voice finding its edge despite the terror dancing in my veins. I raised the dagger, my knuckles white around the hilt. "And I am not his Luna. Stay back." Cassian let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated through the crisp air. "A tracker's stance, but a princess's clothes. You won't last 3 hours in these woods if his enforcers hunt you down. They don't capture, they harvest." He took another step, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. He didn't look like a rogue, he moved with the absolute authority of a king in exile. I said, "Stay back," I warned, lunging forward with a swift, practiced strike of my blade to keep him at bay. Cassian didn't flinch. With lightning reflexes, his hand shot out, wrapping around my wrist with a grip of solid iron to halt the blade. The moment his bare skin made contact with mine, the universe tilted on its axis. The reaction was violent, but it wasn't pain. A sudden, blinding shockwave of pure, golden warmth erupted from the point of his grip, rushing up my arm and crashing directly into my chest. It was an absolute roaring bonfire of heat that slammed into the frozen center of my soul. Instantly, the suffocating icy pressure of Malachi's bond, the constant agonizing ache that had paralyzed my wolf for days, was entirely snuffed out. The phantom noose dissolved into nothingness. For the first time in 3 days, my lungs fully expanded. My wolf didn't shriek. She let out a deep, rumbling purr, pressing her spiritual weight against the barrier of my mind, desperate for more. I gasped, my knees buckling from the sheer, overwhelming relief of the warmth. Cassian stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck, his silver eyes widening in absolute shock. He let go of my wrist, staring at his own palm as if it had just been burned, his chest heaving as he looked up at me through the mist. The freezing wind howled around us, but in the small space between us, the air was electric, thick with a primitive, undeniable heat. We stared at each other, two strangers in a haunted forest, realizing the same terrifying truth. The bond back at the fortress was a lie, and the real fate was standing right in front of me, covered in scars, and living in the dirt. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. The silence that followed the warmth was louder than any howl. Cassian stared at me, his silver eyes burning through the shadows, his massive chest heaving beneath his rugged furs. He took a half step toward me, his hand hovering in the empty air between us, tempting that incredible bone-deep heat to return. But before either of us could speak, a distant, rhythmic baying fractured the night. The enforcers. They had discovered my empty room. "They're on your trail," Cassian rasped, his voice tighter now, laced with a sudden protective tension that sent a thrill straight down my spine. "You need to run. If they find you out here with me, Malachi won't just lock you away. He'll tear this forest apart." What was that? I whispered, my voice trembling as the icy grip of the artificial bond began to claw its way back into my chest the moment his touch was gone. The warmth. Who are you? My name is Cassian, he said, his silver eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt more real than any fate the stars could write. And if you want to live to find out why the Black Monarch's magic is rotting your soul, you need to go back. Play the captive princess for one more night. Find out what he's planning. Before I could answer, he vanished into the fog like a phantom, leaving me with nothing but the returning, suffocating chill of Malachi's tether pulling at my heart. Using every ounce of my tracker training, I doubled back, scaling the black ivy and slipping through the ventilation grate, just as the heavy iron deadbolt on my door groaned open. I managed to throw myself onto the velvet bed, pulling the dark furs over my shoulders and feigning sleep, just as two massive enforcers stepped into the room, their predatory scents filling the space before they satisfied themselves that I was still trapped. I didn't sleep. The relief I had felt in Cassian's arms had given me something Malachi hadn't anticipated, a clear mind. The fog of submission was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp determination. The next evening, while the fortress guards shifted patrols during the twilight hour, I put Cassian's advice into action. I didn't try to flee the estate. Instead, I went deeper into it. Slipping through the shadows of the vaulted corridors, I made my way to the subterranean levels of the northern spire, Malachi's private sanctuary. The air grew progressively colder, smelling of damp stone, ozone, and a sickeningly sweet copper scent that made my wolf growl in warning. The heavy oak door to his study was locked, but a tracker knows that security is an illusion. Using a silver hairpin from my tunic, I manipulated the ancient tumbler lock until a satisfying click echoed through the silent hallway. I slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind me. The study was a Gothic mausoleum of forbidden knowledge. Towering shelves held dusty, leather-bound grimoires, and strange obsidian relics caught the faint moonlight filtering through the high arched windows. In the center of the room sat a massive stone table covered in scattered parchments, vials of dark fluid, and a large, intricate map of the territories. I approached the table, my fingers tracing the lines of the map. My home, the Silverwood territory, was heavily circled in dark, dried blood. Beside the map lay an open journal, written in a sharp, elegant script I recognized instantly, Malachi's handwriting. I began to read, the words jumping off the page like venom. The binding is nearly complete, the text read. The Silverwood lineage carries the pure, uncorrupted blood of the primeval trackers. By drawing her blood during the peak of the upcoming solar eclipse, the forced union ritual will lock the lineage's latent power into my own. The universe will recognize the bond as absolute, granting me total sovereignty over the western seas. My breath caught in my throat, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. He didn't want to mate. He didn't even want a traditional alliance. I flipped the page, my eyes widening as I scanned a detailed hand-drawn diagram of a stone altar. The girl is a catalyst, nothing more. Once the eclipse reaches totality, the final extraction will drain the bloodline's core. The physical shell will not survive the ascension, but the power of the Black Monarch will be absolute. A gasp escaped my lips. He wasn't planning a coronation. He was planning a sacrifice. The false positive bond wasn't a freak accident of fate. It was a calculated dark ritual, designed to mimic love just long enough to lead me to the slaughter. It's rude to read a gentleman's private thoughts, Elena. The smooth velvet voice cut through the silence of the room like an axe. I spun around, my back slamming against the stone table. Malachi stood in the doorway, completely framed by the darkness of the corridor. His long black fur coat draped over his broad shoulders, and his dark eyes burned with a terrifying absolute amusement. He didn't look angry. He looked like a cat that had finally cornered a mouse that thought it was clever. He closed the door behind him, the heavy thud echoing like a death knell in the quiet room. As he stepped into the pale moonlight, his dark eyes flared with that strange, unnatural violet light I had seen at the summit, and the artificial bond in my chest suddenly flared with an agonizing burning pressure that brought me straight to my knees. "You really are an exceptional tracker," Malachi murmured, walking slowly toward me, his cane tapping rhythmically against the stone floor. "But you see, my love, I wanted you to find this. It saves us both the trouble of pretending." Chapter 5. Stolen. Fire. The pain of the forced bond wasn't just a physical ache, It was an invasion. It felt as though Malachi's violet magic was pouring liquid mercury into my veins, heavy and toxic, forcing my limbs to lock and my spine to bend. From my knees on the cold stone floor I stared up at him. I refused to look down. If I was going to die in this Gothic nightmare, I would do it looking my executioner in the eye. A beautiful defiance, Malachi murmured, stopping a mere foot away from me. He reached down, his gloved fingers wrapping around my jaw, forcing my head back. The contact made the icy pressure in my chest spike, a suffocating weight that made the air in my lungs feel like shattered glass. But defiance is an expensive luxury, Elena. Especially for a catalyst whose time is running out. You're a monster, I choked out, the words scraping past my teeth. The Pax will never follow a tyrant who builds his throne on blood magic. Malachi let out a soft, melodic laugh that sent a shiver of pure dread down my spine. The Pax follow strength, my love, and once the solar eclipse reaches totality tomorrow night, I will possess a power that makes Pack law irrelevant. Your father will bow. Your people will submit, and you will be the beautiful foundation upon which my empire is built. He released my jaw, dismissing me with a careless flick of his wrist. Take her back to the spire, he commanded into the shadows. Two massive enforcers stepped forward from the darkness of the corridor, lifting me brutally by my arms. I didn't fight them, I couldn't. My wolf was still paralyzed beneath the weight of his spell, thrashing silently against an invisible cage. But as they dragged me back toward my lavish cell, my mind was working with a cold, desperate clarity. Tomorrow night. The timeline had shifted. The moon was moving faster than his scholars had predicted. I had less than 24 hours to break the stars. The guards threw me into my room, the heavy mahogany doors slamming shut, followed by the definitive, mocking echo of the deadbolt sliding into place. I didn't wait. The moment the footsteps of the guards settled into their stagnant rhythm outside, I scrambled toward the volcanic hearth. My hands were raw, bleeding from the previous night's escape, but the adrenaline overrode the pain. I hauled myself up the iron reinforcement bars, ignoring the scraping of stone against my skin, and burst through the exterior vent into the freezing mountain air. I ran. I didn't care about mapping perimeters anymore. I didn't care about stealth. I ran blind, driven by a primal, desperate need to find the only source of heat in this frozen hellscape. The artificial bond tore at my soul. With every yard of distance I put between myself and the fortress, a rubber band stretched to its absolute limit, threatening to snap and take my sanity with it. I collapsed into the clearing at the edge of the border woods, my knees hitting the frozen snow, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. The sky above was already beginning to bruise, a deep, unnatural violet hue creeping across the horizon as the shadow of the eclipse began its early approach. You're sloppy tonight, little bird. The gravelly voice cut through my panic like a warm hearth fire. I looked up through my blurred vision. Cassian stepped out from the ancient twisted pines. He looked massive, a towering shadow of rugged furs and silver eyes. But the moment he saw the state of my bleeding hands and the sheer terror in my eyes, his cynical expression vanished. In 2 long strides he crossed the clearing and dropped to his knees in front of me. He didn't hesitate. He reached out and wrapped his massive, calloused hands around mine. The impact was instantaneous. A roaring, majestic wave of absolute fire erupted from his skin, slamming into my chest. The suffocating ice of Malachi's bond didn't just fade. It exploded into nothingness, shattered by a pure, ancestral warmth that made my entire body tremble. I let out a broken gasp, leaning forward, my forehead resting against his broad chest as my lungs finally unlocked, drawing in the crisp, clean air. My wolf howled inside my mind, a beautiful, triumphant sound of recognition. Cassian stiffened, his arms instinctively wrapping around my waist, pulling me impossibly closer. The heat between us was electric, a fierce protective barrier that kept the entire world at bay. What did he do to you? Cassian rasped, his voice thick with a sudden, dark fury that made the earth beneath us seem to vibrate. His silver eyes burned down at me, tracing the bruises on my jaw left by Malachi's grip. The ritual. It's tomorrow night. I breathed out, gripping the rough leather of his vest. He doesn't want an alliance, Cassian. He's using a forced blood bond to drain my lineage's power during the eclipse. I won't survive it. He's going to sacrifice me. Cassian's grip tightened until it was almost painful, a low, primal growl vibrating deep within his chest. Not while I draw breath. He pulled back slightly, his silver eyes searching mine with a desperate, heavy intensity. He took everything from me, Elena. He used that same forbidden magic to corrupt my pack, to murder my father, and to exile anyone who refused to bow to his shadow. I've spent 2 winters in these woods building an army of rogues, waiting for a chance to tear his throat out. But I didn't know why the universe was keeping me alive in the dirt. He reached up, his thumb gently tracing the line of my cheekbone, his touch leaving a trail of beautiful, lingering fire. The universe didn't make a mistake at the summit, Cassian whispered, his voice dropping to a rough, emotional frequency. The stars didn't bind you to him, they bound you to me. He stole the frequency of our bond to bait you into his trap. The realization settled over us, heavy and undeniable. The slow-burn tension that had been humming between us since our first meeting flared into a brilliant, terrifying flame. We weren't just a rogue and a captive, we were 2 halves of a fractured crown, brought together at the edge of the world to destroy a tyrant. But the universe wasn't done playing its cruel games. Suddenly, a violent, blinding pain ripped through my center. I screamed, my body arching as a wave of absolute ice violently slammed back into my chest, tearing through the warmth Cassian was giving me. Across the valley, the Gothic towers of the fortress flared with a sickening violet beacon of light. Malachi had activated the anchor. He knew I was gone. And this time he wasn't just pulling the leash, he was snapping it. Elena, Cassian shouted, his silver eyes wide with horror, as my skin turned deathly pale, the unnatural ice beginning to freeze the very breath in my throat. Chapter 6. Tightening Noose. The psychic pull of the anchor was a physical mutilation. It felt as though an invisible hook had snagged behind my ribs, dragging my body backward across the frozen snow, while my soul remained anchored to Cassian's warmth. I clawed at the air, my vision fracturing into jagged shards of black and violet light. Elena, hold on to me. Cassian's voice sounded miles away, distorted by the roaring rushing of blood in my ears. He lunged forward, his massive arms wrapping around me, trying to pour his fierce, natural fire back into my system to counter the dark magic. But the anchor was too strong this time. Malachi wasn't just summoning a runaway, he was channeling the dark, oppressive weight of the entire Obsidian Packlands through the bond. If Cassian held on to me any longer, the conflicting currents of ice and fire would tear my heart apart from the inside out. Let me go, I choked out, a drop of blood spilling past my lips from the sheer internal pressure. If you don't, it will kill us both. Cassian's silver eyes flared with an agonizing, desperate fury. He looked at the fortress across the valley, where the violet beacon pulsated against the bruising sky, then back at my pale, dying face. He knew the tracker's truth. Sometimes, to survive the hunt, you have to let the predator think he's already won. I will find you, Elena, he rasped, his voice a rough, emotional promise that burned hotter than his touch. Tomorrow night, when the sky goes dark, look for the fire in the trees. I am coming for his throat. He slowly released his grip. The moment his skin left mine, the rubber band snapped. The invisible tether violently yanked my consciousness back toward the stronghold. I didn't walk. I was propelled through the dark woods like a ghost, my legs moving under the absolute control of a foreign will until I stumbled out onto the cobblestones of the fortress courtyard. Waiting for me at the center of the square was Malachi. He stood beneath the pale moonlight, his hands resting elegantly on his silver-headed cane, surrounded by a dozen heavily armed enforcers. He looked at my tattered tunic, my bleeding palms, and the wild, feral desperation in my eyes. An admirable effort, Elena, he murmured, his voice smooth as silk and cold as a tombstone. But you see, a bird can only fly as far as its cage allows, and your cage encompasses everything I own. He didn't yell, he didn't strike me. That was what made him truly terrifying. His cruelty was entirely clinical. He raised his hand, gesturing to the enforcers. Bring her to the solar, it's time we ensure our bride stays put. I was dragged into the upper tower, into a room flooded with the eerie, artificial light of hundreds of violet candles. Malachi stepped in behind me, closing the heavy doors. The air in here was thick, smelling of sulfur and burnt sage. You met someone out there, Malachi said, walking a slow circle around me as I stood trembling in the center of the room. The anchor registered a counter-frequency, a residual warmth. Who is hiding in my woods, Elena? The psychological chess match had begun. If he discovered Cassian was alive, and that Cassian was my true fated mate, he would deploy his entire army to butcher the rogues before the eclipse even began. I had to build a wall around my mind, I had to hide the fire behind a layer of absolute submissive ash. No one, I lied, forcing my voice to shake, playing into the weak, broken girl he expected me to be. Just the winter, the cold. I was trying to run home. I want my father. Malachi stopped in front of me, leaning down until his sharp, aristocratic face was inches from mine. His dark eyes narrowed, searching the depths of my pupils. Suddenly, I felt a violent push against my consciousness. He was using the forced bond to invade my thoughts, trying to rip the truth directly from my brain. Images flashed behind my eyelids, the Silverwood longhouse, my father's face, the frozen pines. With every ounce of my tracker training, I channeled the memory of the freezing wind, using the mental image of a brutal blizzard to bury the memory of Cassian's touch. I let the ice swallow my thoughts, presenting Malachi with nothing but an empty, frozen void of despair. For a long, agonizing moment, the pressure in my skull was unbearable. Then, with a dissatisfied click of his tongue, Malachi withdrew from my mind. Pitiable, he sneered, straightening his posture and wiping his gloved hand as if touching me had dirtied him. You are just like your pack, small, fragile and terrified of the dark. I expected more from the primeval lineage, but a broken vessel will still hold blood just fine. He walked toward the narrow arched window, looking out at the sky. The shadow of the eclipse was accelerating, a dark velvet bite already eating away at the edge of the sun, casting long, twisted shadows across the valley. Change of plans, Malachi announced, his voice echoing with a chilling finality. The celestial alignment is peaking earlier than anticipated. We will not wait for tomorrow night. He turned back to face me, a cruel, triumphant smile cutting across his beautiful, monstrous face. Your coronation, and your sacrifice, will take place tomorrow at high noon. Prepare yourself, Elena. Tomorrow you die so that I may live forever. The doors slammed shut behind him, the heavy iron deadbolts sliding into place, with a sound that felt like the final nail in a coffin. I collapsed to the floor, my hands gripping my knees as the sheer weight of the shortened timeline hit me. High noon. Cassian was planning a night assault. He thought he had until the moon took the sky, but the shadow was coming early, and if I couldn't find a way to warn him, he would march his army straight into a trap, and arrive to find nothing left of me but a corpse on an altar. Chapter 7. The. Gathering storm time is a luxury when you're hunting, but it becomes a weapon when you are the prey. The hours following Malachi's announcement blurred into a waking nightmare. The fortress around me transformed into a hive of dark activity. Through the heavy wood of my door, I could hear the rhythmic clanking of iron armor, the sharpening of ceremonial blades, and the low, guttural chanting of the obsidian elders as they began the preparatory incantations for the noon eclipse. The sky outside my window was a sick, bruised violet. The sun was rising, but it brought no light. Only a dim twilight glow as the moon's shadow slowly, relentlessly ate away at its golden edges. I sat on the edge of the charcoal velvet bed, my hands no longer shaking. The panic had burned out, leaving behind a cold, sharp instinct. I was a tracker. If I couldn't run, I had to leave a trail. Tearing a thin strip of silk from the inner lining of my tunic, I pressed my thumb against the raw healing cuts on my palm until the blood welled up, dark and thick. Using my own blood as ink, I drew a single ancient tracker's glyph onto the cloth, the symbol for the altar. Beneath it I slashed a horizontal line, the universal sign for urgency. Noon. I approached the volcanic hearth one last time. I couldn't climb out today. The courtyard below was crawling with heavily armed enforcers, but the wind was howling down the flue, blowing heavily toward the eastern border woods, where Cassian's rogues lay in hiding. Wrapping the bloody silk ribbon around a small piece of loose volcanic stone from the hearth, I threw it up into the chimney, letting it catch the fierce draft. I watched it disappear into the dark flue, praying to the ancestors that the wind would carry my blood straight to the only man who could hear its frequency. At exactly 11 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors to my cage swung open. 4 high-ranking obsidian enforcers stepped inside, their faces hidden behind dark iron wolf masks. They didn't look at me as a future Luna. They didn't look at me as a human being, they looked at me as cattle. It is time, the lead enforcer rasped, his voice distorted by the metal mask. They flanked me, their heavy, iron-clad hands gripping my shoulders. As they led me down the winding marble staircases, the artificial bond in my chest began to thrum with a violent, agonizing resonance. It felt like a string on a violin being tightened far past its breaking point, vibrating so intensely it made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Malachi was drawing on the anchor, pulling my physical body toward the center of his power. We descended into the absolute heart of the obsidian territory, the sacred courtyard. It was a massive amphitheater-like space carved directly into the volcanic rock of the mountain. Hundreds of obsidian wolves stood on the tiered stone ledges, a sea of dark cloaks and pale, watching faces. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low, heavy thrum of a ceremonial drum that beat in time with my fracturing heart. At the center of the courtyard sat the altar. It was a monolith of solid black obsidian stone, polished until it mirrored the bruised, dying sky above. Intricate, jagged channels were carved into the surface of the stone, designed to guide the flow of blood toward 4 ancient glowing runes at the base. Standing beside the altar was Malachi. He had stripped away his heavy fur coat, wearing only a sleeveless tunic of dark leather that revealed the intricate, glowing violet tattoos twisting across his muscular arms. In his right hand he held a long, silver ceremonial blade, its edge catching the pale, dying light of the sun. "Bring her forward," Malachi commanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls like thunder. The enforcers pushed me onto the cold stone platform. The moment my boots touched the sacred rock, the artificial bond flared with a final, devastating wave of ice. I stumbled, my knees slamming into the hard obsidian, my breath catching in my throat as the dark magic locked my joints, pinning me to the floor before the tyrant. Malachi stepped closer, a look of pure, transcendent triumph burning in his dark eyes. He looked up at the sky. The sun was nearly gone, reduced to a thin, burning crescent of gold, wrapped in a terrifying shroud of black. The shadow of the eclipse was minutes away from totality. "Behold the end of the old ways," Malachi roared to the assembly, raising the silver blade high above his head. "Today the stars bow to the Black Monarch. Today we claim the blood of the ancients and we rule forever." The crowd erupted into a deafening, savage howl that shook the very foundation of the mountain. I closed my eyes, my heart hammering against my ribs. The ice was absolute. My wolf was silent, buried beneath the weight of his spell. I looked toward the dark tree line at the edge of the courtyard, searching the shadows of the twisted pines. There was no sign of Cassian. No fire in the trees. High noon had arrived, and the storm was about to break. Chapter 8. The Ritual Eve. The sky didn't just darken, it died. At exactly 12 minutes past noon, the final sliver of the sun vanished behind the moon's black disk, plunging the sacred courtyard into an eerie, unnatural midnight. The air temperature plummeted in an instant, freezing the sweat on my brow. High above us, the corona of the eclipsed sun glowed like a ring of ghostly white fire, a bleeding eye staring down at my execution. "The hour is met," Malachi whispered, his voice cutting through the heavy darkness. He stepped up to the altar, his dark leather tunic catching the spectral light of the corona. He reached down, grabbing my wrist with a grip of solid iron, and hauled my upper body onto the freezing black stone. The artificial bond in my chest flared, an agonizing burst of liquid ice that locked my spine and pinned me flat against the polished obsidian. He raised the silver ceremonial blade. The jagged runes at the base of the altar began to glow with a sickly pulsating violet light, humming in a frequency that made my skull threaten to split open. "With this blood, the old world breaks," Malachi intoned, his voice echoing off the stone tiers where hundreds of silent, watching wolves held their breath. "With this blood, the throne is sealed." He brought the blade down, the silver edge sliced across my bare palm. I gasped, a sharp cry tearing from my throat as a brilliant, agonizing heat flared at the wound. But it wasn't the warmth of a mate. It was the violent extraction of my lineage. My blood, thick and dark, spilled onto the stone, instantly filling the carved channels, racing toward the glowing runes. The violet light flared, blindingly bright. The artificial bond tightened like a noose, pulling the very essence of my wolf toward the surface, ready to be severed and swallowed by the tyrant. "Look at me, Elena," Malachi sneered, leaning over me as his violet tattoos began to burn with a stolen radiant energy. "Look at the man who rewrote your destiny." I forced my eyes open, my vision fracturing into shades of gray and purple. The pain was absolute, but through the haze of my fading consciousness, my tracker's eyes caught a sudden, erratic movement at the edge of the courtyard. A shadow broke from the twisted tree line, not a wolf, a flame. A single, burning torch arched through the pitch-black sky, landing directly in the center of the outer garrison's watchtower. An instant later, the structure erupted into a roaring, majestic column of orange fire. The ceremonial drums cut out, The silence shattered. "Alpha!" a scout screamed from the upper tiers, his voice laced with panic. "The perimeter is breached! The exiles! They're in the walls!" Malachi's face twisted into an expression of savage fury. He spun toward the tree line, his grip tightening on my bleeding wrist. "Secure the perimeter! Slaughter them all! Do not let them disrupt the ascension!" But the warning came too late. The outer walls of the sacred courtyard didn't just fall, they exploded. A massive, coordinated wave of scarred, rugged wolves surged through the breach, their silver and amber eyes glowing in the darkness. They didn't move with the rigid, mechanical precision of Malachi's enforcers. They moved with the feral, unstoppable rage of men who had been living in the dirt, waiting for vengeance. And at the front of the horde rode the storm, Cassian. He was in his mid-shift form, his broad shoulders tearing through his rugged furs, his hands tipped with lethal, razor-sharp claws. His pale scar stood out like a lightning bolt against his dark skin, and his silver eyes burned with a blinding, ancestral fury that completely cut through the eerie midnight of the eclipse. "Malachi!" Cassian's voice didn't just echo, it shook the mountain. It was the roar of the rightful king returning to claim his throne. He leapt from the stone ledge, dropping 20 feet down into the center of the courtyard, crushing 2 iron-masked enforcers beneath his heavy boots. With a single sweeping motion of his massive arm, he threw a third enforcer across the stone platform, his eyes locked onto the altar. "Onto me." "Cassian," I breathed, the word a fragile spark of hope that caught in my throat. Malachi let out a guttural snarl, his regal facade completely slipping away to reveal the feral beast beneath. He raised the silver blade once more, his muscles coiling as he turned back to my pinned form. "If I cannot have the power of the ancients," Malachi roared, his face twisted in madness, "then no one will." He lunged forward, driving the blade down toward my chest. "No!" Cassian screamed. Time seemed to dilate, slowing to a brutal, agonizing crawl. Cassian threw himself across the courtyard, his massive body a blur of silver and shadow as he lunged to bridge the distance. But the altar was too far. The blade was too close. I watched the silver edge drop, the reflection of the black sun dancing on the steel, a fraction of an inch away from tearing my heart open. Chapter 9. Battle for the Pack. The silver blade never met my flesh. In the final microscopic fraction of a second, the universe didn't intervene. Cassian did. He didn't make it to the altar in time to stop the strike, so he threw his own body into the trajectory of the steel. The heavy ceremonial dagger sliced deep into the meat of Cassian's shoulder, a sickening, wet crunch echoing above the chaos of the courtyard. Cassian roared in agony, but he didn't stumble. Using the momentum of his plunge, his massive chest slammed into Malachi, tearing the tyrant away from my pinned form. The 2 alphas crashed into the volcanic stone floor, a tangled blur of dark leather, rugged fur, and bared fangs. The moment Malachi's grip left my wrist, the conduit broke. The suffocating violet light radiating from the altar's runes instantly sputtered and died, and the artificial bond in my chest loosened its icy grip. I gasped, a violent rush of air flooding back into my starved lungs. My wolf broke through her paralysis with a feral, vengeful howl, her golden energy surging back into my limbs. I rolled off the black obsidian table, pressing my bleeding palm against my tunic, forcing my trembling legs to stand. Around us, the sacred courtyard had descended into absolute, cinematic hell. The midnight darkness of the total eclipse was illuminated only by the roaring, orange bonfires consuming the watchtowers. The air was a thick, choking soup of ash, sulfur, and the heavy metallic stench of fresh blood. Cassian's rogue exiles fought with a desperate, savage hunger, their claws ripping through the iron armor of Malachi's enforcers. Snarls, crashes of steel, and the heavy thuds of colliding bodies echoed off the tiered stone walls like a symphony of war. But the true eye of the storm was at the foot of the altar. Malachi rolled to his feet with terrifying grace, his dark eyes flared with an unnatural manic violet light. The blood magic he had already drained from me was circulating through his system, making his muscles swell, and his veins turn a dark, toxic purple beneath his skin. "You are a ghost, Cassian," Malachi hissed, wiping a smear of dark blood from his mouth, his silver blade catching the ghostly white light of the solar corona above. "I broke your pack, I buried your father, you are nothing but a scavenger dying in my dirt." "I am the alpha of this valley," Cassian rasped, his voice a deep, vibrating tremor that shook the stone beneath his boots. Blood dripped heavily from the deep gash in his shoulder, staining his rugged furs a dark crimson, but his silver eyes had never burned brighter. And a king doesn't need a stolen crown to rule. Malachi lunged. The speed was unnatural. He moved like a shadow, the silver blade slicing through the air in a deadly, blinding arc. Cassian ducked beneath the first swipe, his claws tearing across Malachi's ribs, but the tyrant didn't even flinch. The stolen power in his veins kept him numb to the pain. Malachi spun, driving the hilt of his cane heavily into Cassian's wounded shoulder, then followed with a brutal, spinning kick that sent the larger man crashing back against the base of the obsidian altar. Cassian groaned, his head snapping back against the stone, his silver eyes losing focus for a terrifying second. "Cassian!" I screamed. Malachi didn't waste a breath. He raised the ceremonial blade with both hands, stepping over Cassian's pinned, bleeding form. The violet tattoos on Malachi's arms flared with a blinding, toxic light as he prepared to drive the steel straight through Cassian's throat. My tracker instincts dissolved, entirely swallowed by a wave of primitive, unadulterated protective fury. I didn't think about the pain in my hand. I didn't think about the fact that I was smaller. I lunged off the platform, throwing my entire weight onto Malachi's back. My fingers wrapped around his throat, my nails digging into his skin as my wolf lent me every ounce of her ancestral strength. Malachi roared in frustration, his trajectory throwing him off balance as he reeled backward, trying to slam my body against the stone pillars to break my grip. "Get off me, you useless catalyst," he snarled, his mental link violently flaring as he tried to force the icy bond back into my mind to paralyze me again. The ice hit my chest like a freezing tidal wave, threatening to shut down my heart. My vision began to go black at the edges, my grip loosening on his neck as the dark magic demanded my submission. Across the stone floor, Cassian's eyes snapped open. Seeing me fading under Malachi's spell, a sound tore from his throat that wasn't human. A raw, tectonic roar of absolute mated fury that silenced the entire battlefield for a single beat. Cassian surged to his feet, his massive frame silhouetted against the burning watchtowers. He didn't look at Malachi, his silver eyes locked entirely onto mine. A direct line of blinding, uncorrupted gold light slicing through the darkness of my failing mind. "Eleanor, look at me," his voice roared through the psychic void, warm as a midsummer sun. "Choose me, break the chain." Malachi raised his arm, his hand wrapping around my throat to rip me from his back, his silver blade flipping in his hand to finish us both. The steel was moving. The ice was closing in. I had one breath left before the dark magic swallowed my soul forever. Chapter 10. A Chosen Dawn. The ice met the fire, and the universe cracked. As Malachi's fingers tightened around my throat, trying to force my mind into absolute submission, I stopped fighting the dark spell. I stopped resisting the cold. A tracker doesn't fight the blizzard, she uses it to find the path. I looked past Malachi's monstrous violet-eyed glare, locking my gaze onto Cassian's silver eyes. I reached down into the deepest, untouched sanctuary of my soul, the place where my wolf lived, wild and unaligned. I didn't wait for fate, I didn't wait for a star alignment. With every ounce of life left in my body, I reached out and chose him. Cassian. My mind screamed across the psychic void, a direct, unfiltered frequency of gold. The moment our energies connected by choice, the artificial tether inside my chest didn't just snap, it shattered like cheap glass under a hammer. A violent, blinding shockwave of pure, primordial fire erupted from my center, tearing outward in a brilliant ring of golden light. Malachi let out a horrific, strangled shriek as the forced blood bond backfired, the reversing current of magic tearing through his own violet tattoos. The unnatural purple light in his veins exploded, burning him from the inside out. He stumbled backward off the altar platform, clutching his chest, as his dark empire of magic turned to ash in his blood. The forced submission that had gripped the courtyard vanished. All around us, the obsidian enforcers dropped their weapons, gasping as the tyrannical mental fog lifted from their minds. Malachi collapsed onto his knees at the base of the altar, his aristocratic features twisted in absolute horror as his stolen power drained into the volcanic stone. He looked up, his dark eyes wide with the realization of a conqueror who had finally met his end. Cassian didn't hesitate. Stepping through the fading smoke, his silver eyes burning with the calm, absolute authority of a true alpha, he brought his massive hand down in a single, definitive strike. The Black Monarch fell, and the shadow over the valley was finally gone. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the eerie midnight of the eclipse began to recede. The black disk of the moon shifted, allowing the first, blinding sliver of the true sun to cut through the heavy smoke. It wasn't a bruised violet twilight anymore. It was a golden, radiant dawn breaking over the mountain peaks, washing the sacred courtyard in pure, clean light. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a pack, waking up from a long, dark nightmare. Cassian turned away from the fallen tyrant, his gaze sweeping over the hundreds of wolves who now stood on the stone tiers, their heads bowed in genuine, unforced respect. Then, his eyes found me. The rugged, battle-worn alpha stepped up onto the obsidian platform, his heavy boots echoing softly against the stone. He stopped a mere breath away from me. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, melting warmth that made his silver eyes shine like starlight. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gently cradling my face. The moment his bare skin touched mine, the real bond took hold. It didn't slam into my chest like a noose. It didn't burn with the toxic heat of a fever. It was a slow, beautiful homecoming. A gentle, golden tide that filled every empty corner of my soul with peace, strength, and an absolute protective devotion. My wolf let out a long, contented sigh, curling up in the warmth of his presence. "You broke it," Cassian whispered, his rough voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "You shattered a dark ritual that has bound this valley for centuries." "I didn't let the stars decide," I murmured, leaning my face into his palm, letting his heat wash away the last remnants of the winter chill. "I chose you, Cassian. From the moment I saw you in the woods." A beautiful, soft smile touched his rugged lips. He pulled me close, wrapping his broad arms around me, holding me against his chest as the golden sunlight flooded the mountain. Below us, the exiles and the freed wolves of the Obsidian Pack raised their voices, a single, harmonious howl of victory that echoed across the valleys, reaching all the way to the borders of my home in Silverwood. They say the universe doesn't make mistakes. But I know the truth now. The universe only writes the first draft. The real magic, the premium, unbreakable bond that can tear down fortresses and shatter empires, isn't something forced upon you by a spell or demanded by an alpha. It is a choice. And it is a choice I would make every single day, for the rest of our lives beneath the light of our own chosen dawn. And that brings us to the end of the false positive bond. True fate isn't something that can be forced by a spell. It's a choice. And Elena and Cassian have officially chosen their own dawn. If you felt the heat of that final battle and loved watching Malachi's dark empire crumble, please take a quick second to hit that like button and share this story with your fellow romance lovers. It costs nothing, but it helps our pack grow immensely. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you never miss our next high-stakes, cinematic journey. Before you go, I want to hear from you down in the comments. What was your favorite moment? The icy tension of the fake bond, or the exact second Cassian threw himself in front of the blade? Drop your thoughts below. I read every single one. Thank you so much for listening tonight. Stay warm out there, and I'll see you in the next story.